October 23, 1942, 21:20 hours. The El Alamein Line, Egyptian Western Desert. The silence is the enemy. It is a profound predatory quiet that has settled over the sand sea. For Private Hamish McLeod of the 51st Highland Division, the stillness feels heavier than the oppressive heat that lingers long after the sun has bled out below the horizon. He lies flat in a shallow slit trench, the coarse grains of the desert working their way into the wool of his battle dress, into the action of his Lee Enfield rifle, into his very soul. He pulls a worn letter from his breast pocket. The paper is soft as cloth, creased along a map of familiar folds. It's from his mother in Inverness. Her words speak of damp autumn air, the smell of peat smoke, and the eternal comforting gray of the Scottish sky. Here, under a dome of infinite indifferent stars, that world feels more than a lifetime away. It is a dream from which he has violently awoken. Around him, shapes of other men are etched in the pale moonlight, helmets, the glint of a bayonet, the taut set of a jaw. They are all caught in this same suspended moment. They are the tip of a very long spear, poised to strike into the heart of Rommel's Panzer Army Africa. They are the infantry, and their lives depend entirely on a promise made by their new commander, a man with the sharp, unforgiving eyes of a hawk, Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery. He has promised them a new kind of war. No more retreats. No more making do. He has promised them superiority. He has promised them victory. In 20 minutes, that promise will be kept. Stretching for miles behind Hamish and the thousands of other men crouched in the dark, an army of giants waits in silence. 882 of them, field guns and medium guns, British 25-pounders and American priests, their crews standing ready in a vast, choreographed ballet of impending violence. They have been assembled in secret, a colossal concentration of firepower unprecedented in the history of this desert war. Their targets are plotted, their firing tables calculated, their lanyards held in steady hands. Hamish doesn't know the numbers. He doesn't understand the complex mathematics of destruction that have been calculated in command posts miles to the rear. He only knows what his sergeant told him. When it starts, Jock, keep your head down. Then when it moves, you move. Don't stop. Don't ever stop. He folds the letter, tucking the scent of home back over his heart. He checks the luminous dial of his watch. 1:25. The silence deepens, stretching into an unbearable elastic tension. It is the deep breath before the earth begins to scream. He and the men around him are waiting for the storm. They cannot possibly imagine the hurricane that is about to break. The Battle of El Alamein was not to be a battle of brilliant maneuver, but one of brutal, systematic annihilation. By October 1942, the war in North Africa had reached a stalemate at a natural choke point. To the north, the azure waters of the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, the impassable salt marshes and sheer cliffs of the Qattara Depression. Between them lay a 40-mile front of sand and rock, a corridor into which Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had funneled his German and Italian forces. Here, the Panzer Army Africa had dug in, creating one of the most formidable defensive systems of the Second World War. Their primary defense was not concrete or steel, but something far more insidious, the Teufelsgarten, the Devil's Gardens. These were vast, sprawling minefields, 500,000 mines laid in complex patterns, sometimes 5 miles deep. They were designed to channel any attacking force into killing grounds, where expertly sighted anti-tank guns, especially the feared 80mm flak gun, could pick apart Allied armor at their leisure. Rommel's line was a fortress made of explosives and sand. Facing this fortress was the newly revitalized British 8th Army. Under General Montgomery, it had been forged into a powerful, confident instrument of war. The numerical and material advantage was staggering. Montgomery had over 1,000 tanks, including the new American M4 Shermans, against Rommel's 500, many of which were obsolete Italian models. He had twice the men and an air force that was steadily gaining dominance of the skies, but his greatest trump card was artillery. The plan, codenamed Operation Lightfoot, was a masterpiece of industrial warfare. It was built around a simple, brutal concept. If the army could not maneuver around the enemy, it would blast a hole straight through him. The operation would begin with a colossal artillery bombardment, designed to achieve two primary objectives. First, a phase of intense counter-battery fire, aiming to neutralize the German and Italian artillery that formed the backbone of the defensive fire plan. Royal Artillery officers, using advanced flash spotting and sound-ranging techniques, had painstakingly mapped the location of nearly every enemy gun. Second, a creeping barrage of high-explosive shells would lift and move forward at a pace a walking man could follow. A moving wall of steel and fire under which the infantry would advance. This wall of fire would escort the foot soldiers through the Devil's Gardens as sappers worked frantically to clear two narrow corridors through the minefields. Once through, the armored divisions of X-Corps would pour into the breach, engage and destroy Rommel's panzers, and trigger the collapse of the entire Axis position. The weapon for this task was the Ordnance QF 25-pounder gun howitzer, arguably the finest field piece of the war. Supported by heavier American 105-meter guns and British 4.5-inch and 5.5-inch medium guns, the 882 artillery pieces of the 8th Army were primed to deliver over 600 tons of shells on the first night alone. The logistics were biblical. For weeks, thousands of trucks had moved in darkness, stockpiling mountains of ammunition, hiding guns under camouflage nets, until the desert behind the British lines had been transformed into a single, massive gun emplacement. The stage was set for a demonstration of firepower that would redefine the sound of battle. For the men of the Highland Division, the hours before the attack were a slow, agonizing crawl. They had rehearsed their roles for weeks in the rear, practicing night advances and mine-clearing drills until the motions were second nature. But no rehearsal could prepare them for this. The final meal had been eaten, the last letters written. Now, there was nothing left but to wait in the dark, alone with one's thoughts. Private Hamish MacLeod ran a whetstone along the edge of his bayonet. The scrape of stone on steel was a small, personal sound in the vast quiet. Every man had his ritual. Some smoked, their cigarettes cupped in their hands to hide the glow. Others whispered, their voices low and strained, sharing grim jokes that failed to mask the fear. Veterans of past defeats of Tobruk and Gazala were the quietest. They knew what German machine guns and mortars could do to infantry caught in the open. But this time, the officers insisted, would be different. The sheer weight of the guns behind them was a palpable presence. They had been told about the barrage, but the numbers were too abstract to comprehend. What did 1,000 guns sound like? What did 50,000 shells look like? It was beyond imagination. Their faith was placed not in numbers, but in the promise that this steel storm would suppress the enemy, keep his head down, and allow them to cross the deadly open ground. Their immediate task was terrifyingly concrete. They were to follow the barrage directly into the minefields. Tucked into their webbing were rolls of white tape to mark the edges of the cleared lanes, wire cutters for tripwires, and the grim determination of men who knew that a single misstep meant oblivion. They were the light foot of the operation's name, treading softly where the tanks could not. The desert air grew cold. Hamish pulled his woolen tunic tighter, the scratchy fabric a familiar discomfort. He looked up at the stars, impossibly bright and clear. It was a beautiful, peaceful night, a perfect night for killing. A knot of ice formed in his stomach, a cold fusion of fear, adrenaline, and a desperate yearning for the ordeal to simply begin. The waiting, the awful, silent waiting, was its own form of torture. On the other side of no man's land, Gefreiter Klaus Richter of the 164th Light Africa Division shivered in his foxhole. The desert cold bit at him, a damp chill that his threadbare greatcoat could not repel. He was a veteran, his face tanned to leather by 2 years under the African sun, but he was also tired. The food was poor, the water rationed, and the letters from home spoke of bombing raids and hardship. Worst of all, the Generalfeldmarschall Rommel was away in a hospital in Germany. Still, confidence remained. They had beaten the Tommies before. They were masters of desert warfare, skilled in camouflage, ambush, and the use of their superior anti-tank guns. Klaus patted the stock of his MG-34 machine gun. It was a superb weapon, and from his position, it commanded a perfect field of fire over the flat, featureless ground. The Axis forces knew an attack was imminent. Allied aerial reconnaissance, troop movements, and the sudden cessation of probing raids all pointed to a major offensive. General Georg Stumme, commanding in Rommel's absence, had placed his German and Italian divisions on high alert. Their intelligence, however, was incomplete. They expected a heavy but conventional artillery preparation, lasting perhaps an hour before the main assault. They had weathered such bombardments before. Their positions were well dug in, with deep trenches and fortified weapon pits designed to withstand shell fire. Their doctrine was simple and proven: survive the initial shelling, and when the barrage lifted, man the machine guns and mortars. The British infantry, advancing into the minefields, would be silhouetted against the explosions. They would be slaughtered. Any tanks that managed to navigate the cleared lanes would then be engaged by the waiting 88s and Panzerfäufes. Klaus checked his ammunition belts one last time. He and his comrades were outnumbered. They knew that. They were short on fuel, shells, and spare parts. But they were the Afrika Korps. They had the better generals, the better tactics, and the fighting spirit forged in the victories of the past. They were ready. They believed their defenses would hold. They believed they could break the British attack, just as they had done so many times before. They were catastrophically wrong. 40 hours, there was no warning. No single ranging shot. At one precise, coordinated second, the world was torn in two. From the Mediterranean to the Qattara Depression, on a front 40 miles long, 882 guns fired as one. For Hamish MacLeod, the sound was not a sound at all. It was a physical blow. A solid wall of noise slammed into him, a continuous, deafening roar that was felt in the teeth, in the bones, in the very air being forced from his lungs. The ground beneath him began to shudder, then to heave, as if a subterranean monster had been awakened. The horizon vanished, replaced by a flickering, unbroken curtain of brilliant orange light. It was as if the sun had decided to rise again, not in the east, but everywhere at once. For the gunners in the rear, it was a moment of supreme, violent effort. Men worked in sweating, disciplined crews, their movements economical and precise. Breech blocks clanged open, massive brass casings were ejected, and fresh shells were rammed home. Lanyards were pulled, and the guns bucked back in recoil, spitting flame and fury into the night. The air grew thick with the acrid metallic stench of cordite, a choking fog that swirled around the roaring batteries. For Klaus Richter, it was the apocalypse. One moment he was scanning the silent darkness, the next his world ceased to exist. The ground erupted around him. The air was filled with the demonic shriek of incoming shells, a sound that crescendoed into a series of shattering, ground-splitting detonations. The concussions were immense, picking men up and throwing them like dolls, collapsing trenches, and burying machine gun posts under tons of sand. The first 15 minutes were dedicated to counter-battery fire. A storm of steel fell upon the known and suspected positions of the Axis artillery. Guns were smashed into twisted metal, ammunition dumps erupted in spectacular secondary explosions, and communication lines were vaporized. Command and control on the Axis side simply disintegrated. Then, at 21:55, the barrage shifted. It began to creep forward. A curtain of high-explosive shells 400 yards deep started its slow, methodical march across no man's land, moving at a precise 100 yards every 2 minutes. It was a moving wall of death. Anything in its path, barbed wire, machine gun nests, human beings, was pulverized, churned into the very soil. Behind this terrifying shield, whistles blew. Sergeants screamed orders that were swallowed by the din. Hamish and thousands of others rose from their trenches. They were no longer waiting. With their heads bowed against the hurricane of noise and their rifles held at port arms, they began their advance. They walked into a landscape illuminated by hellfire, their path lit by the very storm that was clearing their way. The central, unexpected outcome of the barrage was not a tactical failure or a brilliant enemy counter-move. It was the sheer, paralyzing effectiveness of the bombardment itself. The scale was something the human mind, even the mind of a seasoned soldier, was not equipped to process. The Axis defenders had anticipated an attack, but they had not anticipated annihilation on this industrial scale. The British application of scientific gunnery, the meticulous plotting, the synchronized timing, the sheer weight of metal, was a technological and doctrinal advantage that proved decisive. The counter-battery fire was so devastatingly accurate that the German and Italian artillery response was feeble, sporadic, and quickly silenced. The defenders were stripped of their own protective fire. However, the barrage created its own unforeseen problems for the attackers. The sheer volume of shelling, 50,000 shells in the opening hours, so thoroughly cratered and pulverized the desert floor that it became a moonscape. This soft, churned-up sand proved incredibly difficult for vehicles to traverse. The sappers, working under the disorienting glare of the explosions and choked by a thick fog of dust and smoke, struggled to find and clear the mines. The white tape marking the narrow, safe lanes was often blown away or buried. When the armored columns of X-Corps began to move up, they found their advance slowed to a crawl. Tanks bogged down in shell holes, traffic jams formed in the narrow corridors, and the entire timetable for the breakout began to slip. The barrage that was meant to open the door had, in some places, inadvertently blocked it with rubble. Furthermore, while the bombardment destroyed many forward positions, Some deeply dug-in German machine gun nests survived the deluge. Their crews, emerging dazed and deafened from their shelters, found themselves in a surreal landscape of smoke and fire. But they were veterans. They manned their weapons and opened fire, turning the freshly cleared lanes into bloody killing grounds. The advance did not become the clean breakthrough Montgomery had hoped for, but a brutal, grinding fight through isolated pockets of ferocious resistance. The storm had passed, but its chaotic aftermath would be just as deadly. Warfare is as much a contest of wills as it is of weapons, and on the night of October 23, 1942, the will of the Panzer Army Africa was systematically broken. For the German and Italian soldiers caught in the barrage, the effect was cataclysmic. It was beyond fear. It was a descent into a primal state of shock. Soldiers were left deafened for days, their equilibrium shattered by the constant violent pressure waves. The psychological condition known as shell shock became a mass casualty event. Men were found wandering in the dark, aimless and unresponsive. Others were found huddled in the bottom of their trenches, trembling uncontrollably, their minds permanently scarred by the experience. For Klaus Richter, who survived the initial onslaught when his trench partially collapsed, the world had been reduced to noise, vibration, and terror. His machine gun was buried, his comrades gone, either vaporized or entombed. The meticulously constructed German defense, a thing of pride and confidence just hours before, had been revealed as utterly helpless against this new industrial form of warfare. The feeling was one of complete and total impotence. The Afrika Korps mystique of invincibility, cultivated over years of daring victories, was blown apart in a single hour. Conversely, for the attacking Allied soldiers, the psychological effect was profoundly empowering. The terror Hamish felt was real, but it was overshadowed by a feeling of awe. This terrifying noise was their noise. This destructive power was on their side. For the first time in the Desert War, the common British soldier felt an overwhelming sense of superiority. The barrage was a deafening, terrifying promise that things had changed. It gave them the courage to rise from their trenches and walk towards the enemy's guns, trusting in the shield of fire that moved before them. It transformed an army that had tasted defeat into an army that believed, deep in its bones, that it was destined to win. This surge in morale, this reversal of psychological fortune, was perhaps the bombardment's most significant achievement. The Great Barrage of El Alamein did not win the battle in a single night. It was merely the opening act of a brutal 12-day slogging match. The infantry, including the 51st Highland Division, paid a heavy price in the minefields and in the subsequent assaults on the surviving enemy strongpoints. The armor struggled to break free from the congested corridors, and for a time, it seemed the battle might devolve into a bloody stalemate. But the bombardment had been the decisive blow. It had shattered the cohesion of the Axis defensive line, obliterated its artillery, and savaged the morale of its frontline troops. It allowed Montgomery's infantry to gain a critical foothold deep inside the Devil's Gardens, creating a breach that, despite fierce resistance, could never be sealed. The battle became a dogfight, just as Montgomery had predicted, a grinding battle of attrition that the materially superior 8th Army was guaranteed to win. When Rommel rushed back to the front, he found his army already mortally wounded. After days of fruitless, costly counterattacks, the line finally broke. The retreat that followed became a rout, ending the Axis dream of capturing the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East. The victory at El Alamein, set in motion by that first hour of overwhelming fire, was the hinge of fate, the turning point of the British war effort. As Winston Churchill famously declared, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." It demonstrated that the industrial might of the Allies, when properly organized and applied, could crush even the most battle-hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht. The barrage became a blueprint for future Allied operations, a doctrine of firepower and attrition that would be perfected in Sicily, Italy, and ultimately on the beaches of Normandy. It was the brutal, deafening announcement that a new kind of war had arrived, a war that would be won not just by courage and tactics, but by logistics, industry, and the terrifying, calculated mathematics of overwhelming artillery. For the survivors on both sides, the memory of that night would never fade. The night the desert shook, the sky caught fire, and the world changed to the sound of 1,000 guns.